devil has knocked on my door before, and I've turned him away. He smiled. So what? You want to live forever? William Afton smiled sadly and held out his hand to the animatronic girl. She went to him and put a protective hand on his shoulder. Certainly not like this, he said. Jessica glanced at the robot girl, then back to the man in front of her, his body already riddled with mechanical parts. So what? You're making yourself into a robot? She laughed nervously, then stopped at his grave expression. I didn't realize that you fancied yourself a mad scientist. No, that's science fiction, he said, unamused. The plastic tarp moved again and began to slide off the table, but stopped, not revealing what lay underneath. Everyone dies. Jessica blinked. The adrenaline was wearing off, and she was beginning to feel exhausted. Afton reached up and touched the mechanical girl's cheek, then turned his attention back to Jessica. The most terrible accidents sometimes bear the most beautiful fruits, he said, as if to himself. Recreating the accident. That is the duty and the honor of science. To replicate the experiment and obtain the same result. I gave my life to this experiment, piece by piece. He nodded at the girl, and she approached Jessica with deliberate steps. Jessica backed away, fear surging again. What are you going to do to me? She could hear the urgency in her own voice. Please, enough. As a woman of science, at least try to appreciate what I've done. Afton said. I study archaeology, she said in a flat tone. He didn't respond. The girl stepped closer, giving her an unreadable stare. The plastic tarp slid from the table, and Jessica startled and stared at what was underneath. But her terror turned to confusion in an instant. There was a body, not human or machine. Instead, there was a melted scrap head, whose extensions could be interpreted as arms and legs, but with no defined mechanism or movement. There were no joints, no muscles, no skin or coverings, just masses of undefined tangles and cords, melted into one another and fused together. Most of it seemed fused to the table, burned and blackened at the edges where it touched the table itself, melting into it and seemingly inseparable from it. I don't understand. Jessica's mouth hung open, and she sat down again without thinking. Good girl. Afton smiled thinly. Jessica clenched her jaw. The animatronic girl went back to the table and took up the cotton balls and rubbing alcohol. She started with her fingers again, methodically wiping down each one. Get on with it, Afton said impatiently. The girl did not break her deliberate pace. I touched you. I have to start over, she said. Nonsense. Just do it. I've survived worse than this. The risk of infection, she said calmly. Elizabeth! He snapped. Do as I say. The animatronic girl stopped moving at once, looking startled, and for a moment almost seemed to tremble. Jessica held her breath, wondering if anyone knew or cared that she had just heard the exchange. The girl immediately regained her composure, her eyes relaxing, then opened the drawer and took out a pair of rubber gloves, which she fitted easily over her metal hands. He settled back, and the girl came to him and bent over to press a button on the side of his chair. The chair made a pneumatic hiss and reclined, flattening out like a bed, and the girl placed her foot on the lever at the chair's base. She stepped on it, and the chair jerked upward. Afton made a pained grunt, and Jessica winced reflexively. The girl hit the lever again, yanking the chair up another inch, then stopped, and flipped the monitor back on. It began to beep again, at slightly irregular intervals, and she levered the chair up rapidly, jolting Afton's frail body as it rose. The girl darted her eyes from the monitor to Afton and back again, attentive to his vital signs. When the chair reached waist height, she stepped back, apparently satisfied. Afton let out a rattling breath, then lifted his hand an inch to point at Jessica. "Come closer," he said. She took a small step, and he curled his lips in a smile or a sneer. "I want you to watch what happens next," he said. "What's going to happen next?" Jessica asked, hearing her own voice shake. "How did the creatures at Freddy's move of their own will, with no outside force controlling them?" he asked mildly. He tilted his head, waiting. "The children were still inside. Their souls were inside those creatures," she said, the words brittle. She felt brittle. Like if anything touched her now, she might easily break apart. Afton sneered again. "Oh, Jessica, come now. What else?" She closed her eyes. What is he talking about? What else was inside them? To bind their spirits so inseparably to the bear, to the rabbit, to the fox. How did they die, Jessica? Jessica gasped, covering her mouth with both hands, as if she could stop herself from knowing, as long as she did not speak. How, Jessica? Afton demanded, and she lowered her hands, trying to steady her breath. You killed them, she said, and he made an impatient sound. She met his eyes again, not flinching from the empty socket. He died in the suits, she said hoarsely. Their bodies were bound inside, along with their souls. He nodded. The spirits follow the flesh, it would seem, and also the pain. If I wish to become my own immortal creation, my body must lead my spirit to its eternal home. Since I am still experimenting, I move my flesh piece by piece. He looked thoughtfully over at the creature on the table. More and more, he murmured, almost to himself. It is a test of the strength of my own will. How much of myself can I carve away and still remain in control? Carve away? Jessica repeated faintly, and he snapped his attention back to her. Yes, I will even allow you to watch, he said with a smirk. No thanks, she said, shrinking back, and he wheezed a laugh. You will watch, he said, then gestured to the animatronic girl. Keep an eye on her, Afton said. I have many eyes on her. The girl went to a cabinet and took out another IV bag. Before she closed the door, Jessica caught a glimpse of more like it, and a shelf of what looked like vacuum-sealed cuts of meat. Her stomach flipped, and she swallowed hard. Jessica started to squirm in her seat. There was a hissing sound coming from somewhere, and a smell of burning oil began to fill the room. The table where the mass of metal rested was beginning to glow orange at its center, and the mass on the table seemed to move slightly, although only out of the corner of Jessica's eye. Jessica snapped back to attention and turned toward Afton. He appeared to be asleep. His chest rose and fell with slow breaths, and his eyes were closed. His eyelid draped loosely over the steel rod in the center of his missing eye, the thin skin hanging into the empty socket. The girl nodded and moved to the table. Jessica swallowed, the rotten smell swelling around her. She had ceased to notice it, her nose tuning it out. But now it was everywhere, thickening the air with the miasma. An operating theater. He's harvesting the kids for organs, transplanting them into himself? Jessica looked around the room, calculating. The scalpels were too far away to grab, and they wouldn't even scratch the animatronics girl's paint. If she ran, she would be dead before she was halfway to the door. Jessica forced herself to watch. The animatronic girl went to William Afton's side, then checked the monitor again with care. She unbuttoned his pajama top and splayed it open, revealing his chest, and the massive scars that had covered it since before he went by the name Dave. The girl tugged the waist of his pants an inch lower, so that his torso was fully exposed, then nodded, took off her gloves, and replaced them with new ones. Then she took up one of the scalpels. Jessica looked away. "You have to watch," the girl said, her voice chilling, a human voice stripped of human intonation. Jessica jerked her head up. The animatronic's eyes were on her. "He wants to see you watch," she repeated, the pleasant veneer cloaking her voice once more. Jessica gulped and nodded, fixing her eyes on the scene before her. "I don't think you understand," the girl said. "Go wash your hands." Shakily, Jessica got to her feet and went to the sink, feeling as if she might pass out at any moment. She turned the sink on and watched the water spiral down the drain, the shiny stainless steel gleaming through in the bright light. "Wash your hands!" Jessica obeyed, pushing up her sleeves above her elbows and washing her hands all the way up to the forearms, foaming up the soap over and over as she had seen doctors do on TV. She rinsed them finally and turned to the animatronic girl. "What am I doing?" she asked. The girl ripped open a plastic package and took out a towel. She held it out to Jessica. "You're going to help." Jessica took the towel and dried her hands, then put on gloves from the box the animatronic girl directed her to. "You know the thing isn't sterile, right?" she muttered, glancing at the mass on the table. Jessica gasped and took a step toward the table. From this angle, she could see more of its form. It was a melted mess, but she could recognize certain elements in the mass, a fused scrap on the table. A leg, a finger, an eye socket. I recognize these parts," Jessica said, but there was no answer. "These look like endoskeletons from Freddy's. The original Freddy's." Jessica began calculating in her head, measuring to herself how much this mass must weigh, and its size relative to the size of the endoskeletons she remembered. Before she could think further, the creature on the table attempted to lift its leg, the makeshift knee bending partially. There was no mechanical device that she could make out. It seemed to be moving of its own will. After a second, it dropped back to the table. "Where did you find these?" Jessica stepped back. "What did you do? Why did you melt them all together?" "Hand me the scalpel," the girl said patiently. The surgical implements were laid out in a neat row of the rolling table, on a piece of paper, along with a set of curved needles, already threading, and a small, kitchen-sized propelling torch. The creature on the table tried again to lift its leg, and suddenly, Jessica understood how it was able to move. "They're still in there!" Jessica screamed. "The children, Michael!" The creature withered pitifully, as if responding to her voice, and Jessica's heart wrenched. "They're in there, and they're in pain." "I guess I should have kidnapped Marla if I wanted a nurse," the girl said sardonically. "I told you, he wants you to watch. Look over here." Jessica obeyed, feeling her head go light as the girl pressed the scalpel into Afton's skin. "Don't pass out." She drew the blade across his lower abdomen with steady, practiced hands, making a 6-inch incision. She held out the scalpel, and Jessica stared for a moment before realizing she was supposed to take it. "He wants you to watch. It's the only reason you're alive. If you don't watch, then there is no reason for you to be here. Do you understand?" Jessica steadied herself. "Breathe. Don't faint. Think about something else. John, Charlie. No! I'll start crying. Something else. Something else. Shoes. Black boots, knee-high. The kind that look like riding boots. Italian leather. Jessica took the scalpel and set it down, where it had been, and the blood dripped onto the paper, seeping into the fibers. Jessica took another deep breath. The animatronic girl had one of her hands inside the incision and was pulling it back, peering into the wound she had just made. Scalpel, she said again, and Jessica picked up a new one and handed it to her. Watch, the girl warned, and Jessica watched as she reached into the incision and cut something inside. Jessica flinched. Shoes. Maroon clogs. Chunky heel. 3 inches. Patchwork stitching. The girl held out the scalpel, her hand still inside Afton's body. Take it. Give me clamps. Jessica took the scalpel and replaced it. Clamps? She asked, starting to panic as she searched among the instruments. They look like scissors, with teeth instead of blades. Open them and then hand them to me. And do it fast. Shoes. Jelly sandals, purple, sparkly. Jessica grabbed the clamps and tried to open them, but they were stuck together, hooked by odd clamps at the top. Hurry up! Do you want to die? Yes, I do! Jessica wanted to shout, but held her tongue. She pinched the scissor handles together, and they came free. She handed them to the girl, relieved, and watched as she struck the pointed end into the opening and pitched whatever she had been holding, clamping it shut. She took her hand slowly out of the wound and looked at Jessica. You have to be faster. Scalpel, then I'll need clamps right away. Jessica nodded. Shoes. Green suede kitten heels with a rhinestone strapped to the ankle. She handed the girl the scalpel, then wrestled the clamps open as fast as she could, and was holding them out by the time the bloody blade was returned to her. She watched dizzily as the animatronic girl made another cut, severing something she could not see, and using the last set of clamps to hold it shut. The table behind them began to hiss more loudly, and the orange glow intensified. Jessica took a step sideways to get away from the heat. The glow spread to the creature on the table, and parts of it seemed to turn from side to side. Hold out your hands, the girl said. Platform sneakers, denim, hideous. Jessica held out her hands for the clamps, but the girl left them in place. Instead, she slipped both hands into Afton's open body and lifted out a bloody object. His kidney. That's his kidney. Black leather combat boots. Black leather combat boots. Charlie's black leather combat boots. The animatronic girl held the kidney up in the air for a moment, and blood dripped from it onto her face. Charlie's boots. Charlie! The girl turned to Jessica as she shrank back. Hold out your hands, the girl repeated with cold insistence, and Jessica obeyed, fighting not to retch as the warm organ was placed gently in her hands. It's meat. It's not part of a person. Just think of it as meat. Platform sneakers, stiletto boots, penny loafers. She watched in a daze as the girl took a curved needle and black thread and began to sew William Afton back together, starting with his innards and ending with the first incision, making a row of X's across the left half of his body. At last, she finished, snapping the last thread off with practiced ease. What's next? Jessica asked, her voice sounding faint against the rushing in his ears. Yellow sneakers with a blue streak on the side. Those brown pumps Mom got me. Oh, Mom. The next part is easy, the girl said, pulling the gloves off and picking the kidney up again with her hand and approaching the table where the mass lay. What are you going to do? Jessica quivered. What do you think all this was for? The girl said softly. He told you, piece by piece. Jessica looked down at the creature on the table, glowing orange at its core, and dripping fluid from its various parts, the drops landing with a hiss on the hot surface. This is a transplant, she said. The mass of melted parts for a moment looked human, its demeanor suddenly childlike as it swimmered, and its head turned to face Jessica. For just a moment, Jessica thought she could make out eyes looking back at her. Suddenly, the silence was broken as the animatronic girl clenched her fist around the kidney and slammed it against the creature's chest, pressing so hard that the metal underneath sank inward, embedding the kidney deep inside where it gurgled and hissed. More fluid seeped out the sides of the creature and burned on the table as the girl wrenched it back and forth inside. She pulled her hand from the cavity she had created, her hand charred black, and rested it at her side, extending and retracting her fingers as though making sure they still worked. "Now we are done," she said. She brushed past Jessica and went to the cabinet, and emerged with a long needle. She strode purposefully to William Afton's side, stopped with her fist raised over her head, then brought the needle down, plunging it into his chest. A second passed, then he heaved an enormous breath and groaned. The girl pulled the needle from his chest and set it gently on the table beside him. William Afton opened his eyes, and a single eyeball moved back and forth between Jessica and the animatronic girl. "Is it done?" he asked. Jessica screamed. The intensity of it roused her from her daze, and she screamed again, letting the sound drown out everything else. Her throat went raw, but she screamed again, clinging to the roar of her own voice. For an instant, she felt like if she kept screaming, nothing worse could happen. The air around the girl shimmered, and Jessica's vision blurred in front of her. Something was moving. In a movement, her eyes cleared, and Charlie was standing in front of her. "Jessica, don't worry. You can trust me," Charlie said cheerfully. A hand was stroking her hair. The sun was going down over a field of grain. A cluster of birds were fluttering overhead, their calls echoing out over the landscape. "I'm so happy to be here with you," a kind voice said. She looked up and nestled against him. Her father smiled down at her, but there were tears in his eyes. "Don't cry, Daddy," she wanted to say, but when she tried to speak, the words did not come. She reached up to touch his face, but her hand passed through empty air. He was gone, and she was alone in the grass. Overhead, the birds began to wail, and their calls sounded like human voices, breaking with despair. "Daddy!" Charlie screamed, but there was no answer, only the bird's lamentation as the sun vanished beyond the horizon. It was dark, and he had not come back. All the birds were gone but one, and that one sounded more human with every cry. Charlie stood unsteadily. By some trick of time, she was no longer a child, but a teenage girl, and the fields around her had turned to rubble. She stood in the midst of a ruined place, but there was a single wall standing in front of her, and a door at the center of it. The birds were silent, but someone was crying on the other side of the door, crying alone in a small, cramped space. She ran to it, banging her fists on the metal surface. "Let me in," she cried. "Let me in. I have to get inside. I have to get inside." Charlie sat bolt upright with a ragged gasp, inhaling like she just escaped from drowning. The doors, the closet. She threw off the gray wool blanket and sheets, tangling herself in the process before she managed to get free. She was so hot she could barely stand it, and the wool had been scratching where it touched her chin. She felt strange, more alert. The world was in sharp focus, and it was jarring, as if she had been drifting in some kind of shadowy, half-conscious state for days. "Everything hurts." She'd managed to whisper to John, but it had been somehow detached from her, and there was some buffer between her body and her mind. Now, her mind clear, the buffer was gone, and she ached all over, a dull, constant pain that seemed to be everywhere at once. She leaned back against the wall. She had not woken a sleepy disorientation. She knew exactly where she was. She was in John's apartment, behind the couch. She was behind the couch because someone is impersonating me, she said uncertainly.
and the sound of her own voice was startling in the empty room. She got to her knees, not quite trusting her legs, then steadied herself on the back of the couch, getting to her feet with effort. She straightened and was instantly dizzy, her head swimming as her knees threatened to buckle under her. Charlie gripped the back of the couch determinedly, picking a point on the wall and staring at it, willing the room to stop spinning. After a moment, it did, and Charlie realized the wall she was staring at was a door. Doors. The thought made her lightheaded again, but she kept a firm hand on the couch and made her way around to the front, then sat down on it carefully. She glanced around the room. So far, all she had seen was the corner behind the sofa. The shades were pulled down, and she could see that the front door was bolted. Charlie lost interest in the rest of it, her eyes drawn back to the other door. It was scarcely ajar, the room behind it dark, and Charlie shivered. Echoes of her dream reverberating in her head. Doors. Someone was on the other side, behind the door. Somewhere small and dark. I was drawing them. Doors. I had to find the door. Then she closed her eyes, remembering. They were running, desperate to get away as the building thundered around them, already falling to pieces when she saw the door. The door called to me. It was hidden in the wall, but I went to it. I knew exactly where it was. As I walked toward it, it was like I was on both sides, walking to it and trapped behind it, separated from myself. When I touched it, I could feel the beating of your heart. And then Charlie's eyes snapped open. John pulled me away, she said, the memory solidifying as she let herself dwell on it. I didn't want to go because... She heard it suddenly, the hiss and the cracks appearing in the wall. Because the door had started to open. Charlie stood, her eyes glued to the door in John's living room. She approached it as if propelled by the same instinctive force, her heart picking up its pace. It's just the bedroom, right? She murmured. But still, she edged toward it slowly. She stopped in front of the door and reached out tentatively, vaguely surprised when her fingers touched real wood. She pushed it gently, and it swung open easily, revealing a girl identical to Charlie. A mirror. She looked the same. Her face was pale and strained, but it was her face, and she smiled instinctively. In the haze of the last few days, weeks, she had been utterly disoriented, fading in and out of consciousness, pain finding her even in dreams. Charlie had not felt like herself, but there she was. She reached out to touch the mirror's girl's hand. You are you, she said quietly. Behind her came the unmistakable sound of a lock being turned, and she whirled around in sudden panic, losing her balance and catching herself on John's dresser. The front door opened, and she shrank back, kneeling to let the dresser shield her. A clamor of voices burst in, all talking at once. There were too many to make out the words, until a familiar voice called, "Charlie?" Charlie didn't move, waiting to be sure. Footsteps came to the doorway of the bedroom, then the voice again. "Charlie?" "Marla!" Charlie answered. "I'm here." She started to get up, but her legs would not take her weight. "I can't," she started, tears of frustration pricking her eyes as Marla hurried over. "It's okay. I'll help. It's amazing you made it this far." Charlie looked at her flatly, and Marla laughed. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's just glaring to me like that. You're so..." "What?" "Charlie. Who else am I supposed to be?" Charlie smiled as Marla took hold of her wrist with medical authority and began to silently count. She looked past Marla to Carlton, who quickly came over. John was standing in the door, but he made no move to join them, not meeting Charlie's eyes. "I didn't want to crowd you," Carlton said, sitting down beside her and crossing his legs. "Charlie, He broke off and swallowed, looking away. "I'm really glad to see you," he said to the floor. "I'm glad to see you too," Charlie said. She looked back to Marla, who nodded briskly. "Your pulse is a little slow," she said. "I want to check it again in a few minutes. I want you to drink some water." Charlie nodded. "Okay," she said bemusedly. "Let's get her onto the bed," Marla said to Carlton, who nodded, and before Charlie could protest, scooped her up into his arms. Charlie glanced around for John, but he had disappeared. Marla pulled the blankets back. Charlie felt the pull of sleep, like something standing behind her gently tugging. She blinked rapidly, trying to rouse herself as Carlton set her down. Marla started to pull the blankets over her, and Charlie waved her hands, ineffectually trying to push them away. "I'm too hot," she said, and Marla stopped. "Okay," she said. "They're here if you need them." Charlie nodded. The tugging was growing stronger. If she just closed her eyes, she would slip back into the dark. Marla and Carlton were talking to each other, but it was getting harder to keep track of what they were saying. A loud bang rattled the small apartment, and Charlie jolted awake, her heart thudding alarmingly, almost instantly. Marla's hand was on her shoulder. "It's just John," she said. "I think my heart rate is back up," Charlie said, attempting to joke, but Marla turned on her with appraising eyes, grabbing her wrist, and started to count again. "Marla, I'm fine," Charlie said, half-heartedly pulling away. Marla held on for another few seconds, then released her. In the living room, John set something down on the floor with force. Carlton gave Charlie a concerned glance, then helped her off the bed, giving her an arm to lean on as they went out into the living room to join John. For a moment, the object was obscured. Then they all moved aside, so she could see the child-sized doll. Charlie sat down on the floor, a little apart from the others. "Ella," she whispered. Some tight, painful knot inside her chest began to loosen, and she felt herself smile. "John, how did you find her?" she asked. John knelt down behind the doll and looked up at her grimly, and her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked. He didn't even answer. "Everyone, keep your eyes on the doll," he said instead, and took something out of his pocket. He flicked his thumb against the object. A tiny motion, and the air around Ella shimmered for a moment, blurring her. Charlie rubbed her eyes and heard Marla gasp. Ella was gone. Standing where she had been was a little girl about 3 years old, dressed in Ella's clothes. The knot in Charlie's chest started to tighten again. "What is this, John?" Marla asked sharply. John flicked his thumb again, and the shimmer passed over the girl. Then she was a doll again, her vacant eyes staring placidly into eternity. Charlie darted her eyes from one to the next. Marla looked scared, but Carlton was fascinated. John, for some reason, seemed angry. Charlie shifted uneasily. John manipulated the object in his hand again, and the little girl appeared once more. Carlton crouched down to look at her, and Marla bent down to see, keeping her distance. John stood, leaving them to stare at Ella, and knelt beside Charlie, giving her the same dark look he'd had since he brought in the doll. "What is this?" he asked harshly, and Charlie stared at him, hurt. John looked away with a pained expression. His face flushed. When he looked back at Charlie, the anger in his face had faded, but was not gone. "I need to know what this is." "I don't know," she said. John nodded and sat on the floor with her, carefully leaving a wide space between them. He opened his hand. In it was a small flat disc. Charlie didn't move to touch it. There was something odd in his manner, something untrusting she had never seen in him before. "Did you know?" "No." Charlie tilted her head, staring at the motionless little girl. "It's the same as Afton's creatures though, isn't it?" John said. "Pattern projection. Bombarding the mind. Overwhelming the senses. This one is different though." She shivered, though she wasn't cold. Suddenly, unable to shake the memory of the twisted bear, his face stripped to the metal staves, the illusion sparking on and off as he loomed over them. "Can I see it?" she said, forcing herself back to the present. John held out the disc, and she took it carefully, watching him warily. He was giving off this sense of a brewing storm, and she was afraid of setting it off. Charlie held the disc up to the light, turning it back and forth, then handed it back. "That's it?" John's eyes widened. "What do you want me to say?" she cried. "I mean, you can't tell me anything about it?" "The others all had that inscription, Afton Robotics. This one doesn't. But I'd bet you noticed that." "Actually, I didn't." John looked at her thoughtfully, then back down at the disc. He flipped the switch, and Marla yelped in surprise. "Sorry, it's a bit jarring if you aren't expecting it," he said, turning back to Charlie with a grin. She smiled, and as he met her eyes, his smile flattered, something troubling passing over his face. Before she could speak, it was gone. He grinned widely and winked at her, then flipped the switch. Marla cried out again, and Carlton laughed. "Stop doing that!" Marla shouted from several feet away. John ignored her and leaned in closer to Charlie, hesitantly, like he thought she might run away. She turned to face him, a wave of nervousness washing over her. She ducked her head, letting her hair fall over her place, letting her hair fall over her face, and he reached out and touched it gently, brushing a strand out of her eyes. He gave her a small smile and flipped the switch once, then again. "That's enough!" Marla called. "This is too weird for me!" John didn't seem to hear her. He was looking at Charlie with a new troubled expression. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," he said. He touched her hair again, this time brushing it back from her face and tucking it behind her ear. "Hey," he said abruptly, changing his tone. "Do you remember your experiment from last year?" She nodded eagerly, then stopped, freshly aware of how long she had been away. "My faces, but they must be gone. Everything must be gone." She looked at John with anxious eyes, but he smiled. "Nothing's gone," he said, and her heart lifted. She felt as if he had just given her a gift. "Jessica packed up all your stuff. She's got it in her apartment." "Oh," Charlie said, darting her eyes around the room. "Jessica, where is she?" "Charlie," John said patiently, and she tried to focus on him. She could feel her attention waning, as if her mind were spreading thin, floating out like clouds. "The faces," John went on. "There was an earpiece so they could recognize you, right?" She nodded. "Could you make it work the other way?" Charlie thought for a moment, then met his eyes again. "You mean make it so that the animatronics can't see you?" She frowned, her focus returning as she concentrated on the problem. "The earpieces emit a frequency that alerts the animatronics to you. It makes you visible. If you inverted the frequency..." She paused. Again. I don't know if it would work, John. It might. It could make us invisible to them. Maybe. But that's a big leap. How would I do it? Invert the frequency. Charlie shrugged. Just switch the wires. Charlie, what part of stay in bed wasn't clear? Marla asked good naturally, coming over to them. John stood, his mouth hanging open, as though Marla had interrupted Charlie's answer, but she didn't seem poised to add more. Sorry, he said hastily. Be careful, Charlie said. She was beginning to feel lightheaded again, and when Marla reached out to help her back to the bedroom, she did not protest. John paused in the door, watching as Charlie curled up on her side, her eyes already closed. Marla raised her eyebrows, and he left, shutting the door halfway. In the living room, Carlton was kneeling beside Ella, now in doll form again, and looking intently into her ear. Carlton? John said, dubiously, and Carlton sat back on his heels. Amazing, he said. She looked human, like actually, for real, a human child. Yeah, I think that was the idea. Can we talk outside? John asked brusquely, and Carlton looked at him in surprise. Sure, Carlton said, with some concern in his voice. Come on. John headed for the door, and Carlton hurried after him. Once they were outside, John looked at Carlton for a moment, thinking. What's the idea? Carlton asked, with a hint of suspicion. Let me try to get this straight in my own head first, John said. Last year, when she was still in school, Charlie had this experiment she was doing, something about teaching robots language. Oh yeah, Carlton nodded enthusiastically. She told me about it. Natural language programming. They listen to people talking around them and to them, and they learn to talk too. Didn't sound like it worked very well though. Well, whatever. She had these earpieces like the robots would only talk to each other. They only recognized each other. You with me so far? I think. Well, if you, Carlton, wanted to be in on the conversation, you would need to wear a special earpiece. The earpieces would make them recognize you. Otherwise, you were just part of the background, like they couldn't see you. Okay. Carlton gave him a puzzled look, and John rolled his eyes. Wearing the earpieces included you in their conversation. It made you one of them, from their perspective. Hate to break it to you, but the big ones already see us. At least, I'm pretty sure they do. See this scar? Will you shut up for a second? I asked Charlie, and she said we might be able to reverse engineer it. We can switch the wires, and instead of the earpieces including us, it would deliberately exclude us. Carlton furrowed his eyebrow. It could effectively make us invisible, John prompted. Switch the wires, Carlton repeated. It would make us and make us not a part of the world they can perceive. Right, John nodded. Carlton waited for John to go on, then added, What do you want me to do? Go to Jessica's house. She's got all of Charlie's old stuff boxed up in a closet. If she's not there, she leaves her spare key under the welcome mat. Carlton raised his eyebrows. Under the welcome mat? That's a horrible place to leave a key. It's a good neighborhood, John said defensively. Carlton raised his eyebrows. Yeah, it's a good neighborhood, John. Nothing bad ever happens here. Carlton slapped John on the shoulder as he headed for the car. I'm on it, he called. John let out a sigh, then went back inside. Marla was sitting on the couch, staring at the television, which was not turned on. How is she? John asked, sitting down beside her, and she shrugged. Okay, considering the circumstances. She turned away from the blank screen, looking distressed. She was locked in a box. That's insane. She was locked in a box. Who knows for how long? Days? Months? She must have been fed, given water, or she'd have starved, but she has no memory of it. She just remembers drifting in and out of sleep. She seems healthy. I don't know what to say. Impulsively, John hugged her, and she sighed, hugging him back tightly. She released him abruptly, looking away as she brushed at her eyes. John pretended not to see. Can I go sit with her for a minute? He said, when she straightened. I won't bother her. I just want to sit with her and know she's there. Marla nodded, her eyes brightening with tears again. Don't wake her up, she admonished. She went to the door. He nodded and slipped inside, closing the door behind him. Carlton pulled into the lot outside, Jessica's apartment building, glancing around for her car. It didn't seem to be there. Guess I'll be breaking and entering. Sorry, Jess, he said, cheerfully as they pulled into a spot, but a sense of dread had already set in. He wanted company, even on this small errand. Let's see what skeletons Jessica has hiding in her closet. He drummed his hands on the steering wheel, tapping down his nerves, and got out of the car. Jessica lived on the 3rd floor. Carlton had only been to her place once, but he found it again easily. In front of the door was a welcome mat. It was dark green, the word welcome written on it, black script. Carlton lifted the mat, but there was nothing under it. For a moment he stared, at a loss for what to do next. Then he flipped the mat all the way over. Taped to the center was a key. Thought you could outsmart me, he murmured, peeling off the clear tape. Can I help you? Someone asked sternly from behind him. Carlton froze. The voice said nothing else, and so with deliberate movements, he finished removing the key, set the mat back on the ground, and smoothed it back into place, trying to seem unconcerned. He put a pleasant expression on his face, stood, and turned to face an elderly man scowling at him from across the hall. He was wearing a faded button-up shirt and holding a hefty book, his finger marking his place. Do I know you? The man demanded. Carlton forced a grin and waved the key in the air. Just visiting, he said. I'm a friend of Jessica's. The old man peered at him suspiciously. She makes too much noise, he said, and shut his door. Carlton heard 3 locks snap into place, then silence. He waited a moment, then turned and hurriedly entered Jessica's apartment. He shut the door carefully behind him and glanced around. The apartment was no bigger or nicer than John's, although it was definitely cleaner. Most of the furniture had probably come with the place, but Jessica had determinedly made it her own. The scuffed floor was as spotless as it could be made without any industrial sander, and Carlton looked guiltily down at his sneakers, thinking maybe he should have taken them off outside. Jessica had covered the worn-out couch in fluffy blankets and thrown pillows. Her textbooks were lined up neatly on a wide bookshelf made out of brightly painted wood planks, and above the shelf was a large corkboard full of photographs, cards, and ticket stubs. Carlton made his way over to it, curious. Let's see what Jessica's been up to, he said, talking to himself, just to fill the silence. The corkboard was full of smiling pictures of Jessica with her friends, a graduation photo with her parents, ticket stubs from concerts and movies, 2 birthday cards, and a few postcards with enthusiastically and illegibly scribbled notes. Carlton let out a low whistle. Somebody's popular, he muttered. Then something else caught his eye. A child's drawing. pinned to the lower corner of the board. He bent down to look, and his throat caught. It was a crayon drawing of 5 children, smiling happily as they posed with a big yellow rabbit. In the bottom left corner, the artist had signed his name, and Carlton reached out to touch it lightly. "Michael," he whispered. He stared into the bright eyes of the yellow rabbit behind the children, and his mouth went dry. "If only I could have warned you, somehow." He swallowed and straightened it up, turning his attention deliberately back to the photos. "She sure goes out a lot," he remarked, opening one of the cards to distract himself. "Happy 15th birthday, Jessica," it read, and he stepped back, feeling slightly ashamed, as suddenly he understood. He glanced at the ticket stubs. They were all from shows in New York. The pictures with old friends were all a few years old. Jessica's new life here didn't give her much in the way of mementos. Carlton turned away from the corkboard, wishing he had not intruded. "The closet," he said loudly. "I have to find the closet with the stuff." There was a kitchenette, and past that, a hallway, presumably leading to the bedroom. He found a light switch and flipped it on, and the closet appeared, halfway down the hall. He opened it, half expecting the contents to come tumbling down on him. But though these were Charlie's possessions, it was Jessica who had done the packing. Stacks of cardboard boxes filled the closet completely, each one labeled clearly. Charlie, shirts and socks. Charlie, books, etc. At the very top of the stack was a long, flat box labeled Charlie, Weird Experiment. Weird Experiment. Feels like the story of my life these days, Carlton whispered. He reached for it, carefully, and had almost gotten it down when he knocked the corner against the box underneath it, sending Charlie, Miscellaneous, to the ground. The box split open, spewing out computer parts and random bolts and scraps of metal, fur, and 2 unattached paws. 3 plastic eyes bounced as they hit the floor, then rolled across the carpet, clacking against each other merrily. This is life or death. Someone else can clean it up, Carlton decided. He stepped carefully over the rest of the mess and carried the box into Jessica's bedroom. He set it down on her bed, careful of the pale blue spread, and dragged the spare key across the packing tape to cut it. He opened the box. Yikes, he startled. 2 identical faces stood upright in the box, staring at each other with blank eyes. They were like unfinished statues. They had features, but they were not refined and seemed incapable of expression. He started to lift them out of the box, then realized that they were attached to something. With care, he managed to extract the entire structure, a large, black box with knobs and buttons, and the faces on their stand, wired to it. It all seemed to be intact. Carlton eyed the wall socket by Jessica's bed for a moment, then grabbed the cord and plugged the whole thing in. An array of lights came on, red and green, flashing on and off, seemingly at random, then stabilizing, some off, some on. Several fans started to whir. Carlton looked at the faces. They were stretching, almost mimicking human movement. Creepy, he whispered. You, me, said the first, and he jumped back, disconcerted. We, she, said the second. He stared, waiting for more, but they were apparently finished for the moment, motionless and silent. Carlton shook his head, trying to make himself focus, though all he really wanted to do was sit here and watch the 2 faces and see what else they might have to say, or talk to them. He went back to the box. The earpieces John had described were wrapped up in a thin layer of bubble wrap. They looked like hearing aids, small clear pieces of plastic, full of whirring, with a tiny switch on one side. Carlton flipped the switch on one and put it in his ear. Instantly, the faces turned to him, tilting up like they were looking straight at him. Can they see me? Hi? Carlton said reluctantly. Who? One asked. Carlton, he answered nervously. You, the other said. Me, said the first. You guys really love pronouns, huh? Carlton said. There was no answer from the faces. He took out the earpiece and flipped the switch off, and simultaneously, the faces turned back to each other. Makes you visible. Right, he thought with a shiver. He turned back to the earpiece itself, sliding his thumbnail into the thin seam that ran around the edge of a casing. It popped open easily, revealing a mess of wires and a tiny computer chip. Just switch the wires. It's that easy, he muttered to himself. There was a lamp on a nightstand beside Jessica's bed, and he turned it on, holding the earpiece under the light. He stared at it, looking for a clue as to what John had been suggesting, angling the tiny object from side to side. At last, he spotted it, a single, empty round input, outlined in red. And why is nothing plugged into you? Carlton said triumphantly. He sorted through the other wires until he found one that matched it, the outline green. He quickly switched the wire to the red line plug and snapped the case back together, then switched it on and stuck it back in his ear. The faces did not move. What's wrong? Don't want to talk to me anymore? He said loudly. There was no response. Excellent, he said, satisfied. He took out the earpiece and put it in his pocket, then grabbed the other one as well. He unplugged the experiment and was about to pack it back into the box when he felt a sudden prickling between his shoulders, as if someone was standing directly behind him. He could almost feel breath on his neck. Carlton held very still, scarcely breathing. Then he spun around, his hand raised to defend himself. The room was empty. He flicked his eyes from side to side, unconvinced that he was alone. But there was nothing there. Just pack up and get out, he said weakly. But his heart was still pounding in his chest, like he was fighting for his life. He took a deep breath and went back to the experiment. Before he could touch it, the room dipped under him like a ship bobbing in the ocean, and he fell to his knees, clutching the bed frame to steady himself. His vision blurred. Nothing was fixed in place anymore. Everything in the room seemed like it was moving at various speeds in different directions. Carlton let go of the bed frame and sank to the floor as a piercing whine arose, quickly ascending to a pitch too high to perceive. He covered his ears, but it did nothing to ease the nausea. The room kept spinning, and his stomach lurched. He groaned, holding his head and closing his eyes, but the movement continued. He clenched his teeth, grimly determined not to vomit. What is happening? He looked. As the nausea over floor, it only made the room spin faster. Carlton? The room snapped back into focus. Everything stopped moving. Carlton didn't move, afraid of setting it all off again. Carlton, are you okay? Said a familiar voice, and he looked up to see Charlie, bent over him anxiously. Charlie? He said weakly. What are you doing here? John sent me to help. What were you doing with all this stuff? She asked. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't break anything, he said, sitting up carefully. The nausea still lingered, but it was easing as he began to trust that the room had steadied itself. He glanced at Charlie, his vision still a little fuzzy. I don't mind. It's all junk anyway. But the way you were rolling around on the floor, you must have activated something or electrocuted yourself. One or the other. Are you okay? I think so, He slumped back against the bed. Nausea? Room spinning? She asked sympathetically. Terrible, he said. She put a hand on his shoulder. Come on, we need to get out of here. She stood and held out a hand to help him up. He took it, standing gingerly. The effects of whatever it had been were almost completely gone. He looked around the room, his vision clear. What exactly were you doing? Charlie asked, and Carlton froze. Her voice was too hard, too polished. He turned to her, keeping his face neutral. He didn't say. John thought you might want to have it, your old experiment. I think he wanted to surprise you with it, he said. He grinned. Surprise! Charlie smiled. You know, your old experiment? Carlton's mind raced. The one with the robotic hand that could play the piano, he added. You remember? Right. How sweet of you to come to get it, she said, a flirtatious note in her voice, and Carlton's blood went cold. He nodded carefully. You know me, always thinking of others, he said, glancing over Charlie's shoulder, at the bedroom door behind her. It was closed. She took a step closer to him, and he stepped back instinctively. She looked surprised for a moment, then grinned, looking down and seeing the two faces in the box. He moved back again, startling when he hit the wall behind him. Carlton, if I didn't know better, I think you were afraid of me, Charlie said in a low voice, stepping so close there was almost no space between them, pinning him to the wall. She reached out toward his face, and he set his jaw, trying not to flinch. She ran her fingers down his cheek, then traced the line of his jaw. He didn't move, his breathing shallow. Charlie brushed his hair out of his face and pressed closer to him, trailing her hand to the back of his neck. Her face was inches from his. Charlie, you're not really my type, you know, he managed to say. She smiled. You haven't even given me a chance. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, don't get me wrong. You're okay looking. But let's be honest, you're nothing to write home about, he quipped, maintaining eye contact. I mean, those boots with that skirt? Charlie's grin started to wane. Sorry, that was rude. I'm sure you'll find a guy someday who appreciates you for who you are. He tried to inch his way toward the door. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm late for quartet practice, so let me just get by you and I'll be on my way. Carlton squirmed, but Charlie didn't budge. I promise I won't tell anyone that I rejected you. Just hit that gym and we can try again in a few years. Carlton, you're obviously flustered. There's only one way to really be sure how you feel, Charlie said softly. She leaned closer, and Carlton screwed his eyes shut. The earpiece. It was in his right pocket. Charlie, you're right. But maybe we should just talk for a while, you know? I rushed into my last relationship and I almost ended up dead in a moldy fur suit. Just distract her until... His fingers closed on the earpiece, and he pulled it from his pocket, opening his eyes at the same time. Carlton screamed. Charlie's face was splitting apart. Her skin had taken on a plastic cast. It was cracked at the middle, splintering into triangular sections. As he watched, her hand tightened around his neck. The triangles lifted up and pulled back like razor-edged flower petals, revealing an entirely different face, sleek and feminine, but definitely not human. The petals of what had been Charlie's face began to move along the round perimeter of the new face, beginning to look more like a saw blade than a flower. The animatronic girl pursed her middle lips, leaning in for a kiss as the blades spun closer and closer to Carlton's face. In a final burst of self-preservation, he yanked the earpiece out of his pocket and jammed it into his ear, flipping the switch. The animatronic girl drew back at once, letting go of Carlton's neck, with a surprised look on her middle face. She glanced around the room. He stared at her, frozen in terror. For a moment, then he realized what was happening.
She can't see me.
He waited, watching as she took deliberate steps backward. Her eyes darted back and forth. She stood for a moment, the plates of her face snapping back together to form the painted, glossy face of a doll. Then suddenly, a ripple of light passed over her, and she appeared to be Charlie again, her face expressionless. After another minute, she turned and went to the bedroom closet. She peered in, pushing clothes out of it, as if something might be hidden behind them, then stepped away. She went to the bed and grabbed a corner, then lifted it off the ground. She considered the empty floor for a second, then let the bed drop with a crash. Once more she scanned the room, and at last, she opened the door to the bedroom and let herself out. Carlton tiptoed behind her, following her into the hall. She stopped short in front of the hall closet, and he almost bumped into her, barely catching himself before they collided. The animatronic girl ripped the boxes from the neatly stacked closet, tossing them haphazardly on the ground behind her. Carlton cautiously stepped back a few feet. When the girl was satisfied, the closet was unoccupied. She checked the bathroom, then walked out into the living room. With one last, dissatisfied glance around, the animatronic girl left Jessica's apartment, closing the door calmly behind her. Carlton rushed to the window, watching as she exited the building and walked away down the road, heading toward the town. Once she was out of sight, Carlton heaved a sigh, gasping as if he had been holding his breath. He felt dizzy again, lightheaded, but this time it was only fading adrenaline. He started to take the earpiece out, then thought better of it and left it in place. He patted his left pocket, reassuring himself that the second earpiece was still there, and he hurried out of the apartment and down to his car. He drove away urgently, heading toward John's house without regard for the speed limit, and hoping the animatronic girl was going the other direction. Carlton heard the door close, and she turned toward it. The room was dark, except for the light filtering in through the small, dirty window, and she squinted to see who had just come in. "John?" she whispered. "Yeah," he said in the same tone. "Did I wake you up?" "It's okay. All I do lately is sleep and dream." The last word was bitter on her tongue, and he must have heard it too, because he sat down on the chair Marla had placed beside the bed. "Is it okay if I sit?" he asked nervously, already there. "Yes," she said. Charlie closed her eyes. The room was different now, safer. "You did something," she murmured, almost to herself, and John leaned closer. "Did I? What did I say?" He cleared his throat, his palms already sweating. "You said you loved me," she whispered, and he jolted as if someone had struck him. "Yes," he said, his voice sounding choked off. "That is what I said to you. You remember that?" Charlie nodded carefully, knowing her response was inadequate. He turned away from her for a second, letting out a forced breath. "It's true, I do," he said in a rush, turning back to her. "I mean, you've been my friend since forever. Just like Marlo or Carlton or Jessica. I would have said that to any of them. Well, maybe not Jessica." "So, you remember some of that night then?" he said briskly. "It's all I remember. And the door." "John!" She grasped his arm, alarmed. "John, the door was opening. I think Sammy was inside. I could feel him there. His heartbeat." She trailed off as another memory overwhelmed her. A moment in the strange, artificial cave under the restaurant that was so like Freddy's, and yet so unlike it. "Springtrap," she said. I fought with him. There was a metal spike, and his head. She could see him, gasping on the rocks, as she grounded the piece of metal tortuously into his wound. I know. I saw it too, John said, an uncomfortable shift in his eyes. He said, I didn't take him. I took you. What? John gave her a puzzled look, and she sighed in frustration. Sammy, I asked him why he took my brother from me, and that was what he said. I took you. Well, you're here now. He's insane anyway. John attempted to smile. He probably just said it to hurt you, to confuse you. Well, it worked. She let her head sink back onto the pillow. John, everyone's avoiding the question. How long has it been? I know it's been more than days, but how bad is it? A month? He didn't answer. 2 months? She ventured. I know it can't be more than a year, or you'd have a nicer apartment. John, tell me, Charlie insisted, hearing her own voice rising, her heart beating faster as she waited for him to speak. 6 months, he said at last. She didn't move. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Where have I been? She asked, her voice barely audible over the rushing sound. Your Aunt Jen. You were with her. At least, I think that's where you were. You think? I'll tell you everything, Charlie, I promise. As soon as I can understand it myself. There are things I don't know. I just don't know. He finished helplessly. She lay back, staring up at the ceiling. In the dim light, the stains looked like they could be decorative. About your aunt, John went on, something awful in his voice. I saw her that night. Charlie looked sharply at him. That night? The building was coming down. You were inside, and I was trying to get you, and she was just suddenly there. I don't know how she got in or why. It was her house, technically, Charlie said, turning back to the ceiling. Maybe she was there looking for me. And that makes sense to you? I don't know what makes sense, she said steadily. It doesn't make sense what I remember and what I don't remember. There's not one moment where suddenly it all goes blank. But I don't remember Aunt Jen being there. Okay, he said. I have to see her, Charlie said, with sudden intensity. She's the only one who knows how all of the pieces fit. She's the one with all the secrets. She's always tried to protect me from them. But now, secrets aren't protecting anymore. She stopped. John looked stricken, his face stuck between expressions like he was afraid to move on. John? Charlie said, a knot forming in her stomach. John took a breath as if to speak, then hesitated. She could see he was searching for words. She gave them to him. She's dead, isn't she? Charlie said faintly. She felt like she was drifting off again, but she was not losing consciousness. John nodded. I'm sorry, Charlie, he said hoarsely. I couldn't stop it. Charlie looked back up at the stains. I should feel something, she thought. You need your head clear, she whispered, echoing her aunt's habitual reminder. What? John was watching her anxiously. Paperwork, she said more loudly. She kept files on everything, locked up in cabinets. Whatever she knew, she wrote it down. Or someone else did. Where was she? A house in Silver Reef, the ghost town. John stammered. He looked taken aback. There were files there, boxes of papers. Then we have to go back there, Charlie said firmly. John looked as if he wanted to protest, but he just nodded. She might go back there, too, if she thinks you'll be there. John shared a worried look. We have to go. Then we go there, he said. Charlie closed her eyes, the decision realizing her into sleepiness. The door opened, and dimly, Charlie heard Marla and John whispering to each other. She took a deep breath, like she was going underwater, and let herself slip into the dark.
Hey,
Something poked Jessica's shoulder, and she shrugged it away and rolled over, still half asleep.
hey, you okay?
Something poked her cheek, much harder, and she opened her eyes and looked up to see a ring of children surrounding her, staring with wide eyes. Jessica screamed. Someone grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth, and she struggled to get away. You have to be quiet, a desperate voice whispered, and she turned to face a red-haired girl of about 7, looking at her anxiously. If you're not quiet, it'll come get you, she explained. Jessica sat up carefully and put a hand on her head. It felt like it was stuffed with cotton, and her sinuses were burning. Not again. Chloroform, or whatever that gas was. What? The girl asked. Nothing, Jessica said, looking at the frightened faces that surrounded her. There were 4 children in all, 2 boys and 2 girls. There was the young red-headed girl with freckles on her nose, and a stocky African-American boy of about the same age, who looked like he had been crying before she arrived. He was sitting cross-legged with a young Latina girl of 3 or 4 on his lap, hiding her face in his shirt. Her fine brown hair had all but come loose from 2 long braids down her back, each caped with a pink ribbon, and the matching pink shoes and t-shirt she wore were stained and filthy. The last little boy, a skinny blonde kindergartner with a massive bruise on his forearm, hung back a little from the rest, his hair hanging over his face. They were all looking at her like they expected her to do something. What is this disgusting place? Jessica wiped her hands on her shirt and shook out her hair as though it might be full of spiders. She stopped in mid-shake and turned to the kids as though seeing them again for the first time. Her mouth hung open slightly. You're the kids. I mean, you're the kids, the ones that were taken, and you're alive. She suddenly remembered the mother at the hospital. We have to find that kid and bring him home. Jessica had insisted to John, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Now the kids were standing right in front of her. It's not too late to save you, she thought, filling her with new purpose. She looked at the little blonde boy. Are you Jacob? She asked, her heart fluttering and his eyes widened in response. Hey, it's going to be okay, she said, trying to believe her own words. I'm Jessica. None of them answered her right away, instead glancing at one another, trying to reach some silent conscience, leaving them to it. Jessica stood surveying their surroundings. It was a dank, brick-walled room with a very low ceiling, so low that Jessica couldn't fully stand upright. The room had exposed pipes all along the walls, some of them giving off plumes of steam. There was a large tank in one corner, probably a hot water heater, and in the far corner was a door. Jessica went to it. Don't! The red-headed girl squealed. It's okay, Jessica said, trying to make her tone soothing. I'm going to get us all out of here. Let's just see if it's locked, she said, hearing her own voice ring out cheerful and hearty. She sounded patronizing. It was a tone she'd always despised in adults when she was a child. I'll just check, she said more normally. She walked briskly toward the door. No! 3 voices cried. Jessica hesitated, then grasped the knob firmly and gave it a twist. Nothing happened. Behind her, one of the children let out a sigh of relief. "It's okay," Jessica said, turning back to them. "There's always another way out." She scanned their anxious, grimy faces. "What happened here?" she asked. The boy with the child on his lap looked at her suspiciously. "Why should we tell you anything? You could be one of them." "I'm in here, same as you," Jessica pointed out. She dropped down to sit beside him, putting herself on the children's eye level. "My name is Jessica." "Ron," he said. The little girl on his lap tapped his shoulder, and he bent down as she whispered something in his ear. "Her name's Lisa," he added. "Alana," the red-headed said, a little too loudly. The blonde boy didn't say anything. Jessica eyed him, but did not ask. "Hi, Ron, Lisa, Alana, and Jacob," Jessica said with excruciating patience. "Tell me what happened." "She ate me in her tummy," Lisa whispered. Instantly, Jessica felt the blood rush from her face. "You mean the clown girl?" Jessica asked softly. "The robot girl?" The children nodded in unison. "I was in the woods," Alana said. She held her hand against her stomach, then mimed the clamp, shouting out, "Jump!" she said, her face deadly serious. "I was riding my bike by my house," Ron said. "There was a woman in the road. She came out of nowhere, and I fell off the bike. I was trying not to hit her." He gestured to his knees, and Jessica noticed for the first time that they were scabbed over. He's been here long enough for those to heal, she thought, but held her tongue, afraid if she interrupted, he would stop talking altogether. "When I got up, she was standing over me," Ron continued. "I thought she was trying to help. I told her I was okay, and she smiled, and then..." He glanced down at the girl on his lap for a moment, then went on. "I swear, honest, her stomach split right open, and there was this big metal thing that came out of it, and..." He shook his head. "She's not going to believe us." "Did the thing grab you and pull you inside?" Jessica asked softly, and he looked up at her in surprise. "Yeah," he said. "Did she get you too?" "No, but I've seen it happen," she said half truthfully. "Then what?" "I don't know. Next thing I remember, I woke up in here." "What about her?" Jessica gestured to the girl on his lap. He shrugged, looking briefly embarrassed. "As soon as she woke up, she climbed onto my lap." "Do you know her?" "You mean from before?" He looked down at the little girl again. "No, none of us knew one another before," Alana said. Jessica looked at the little blonde boy, and he looked away. "Okay, well, listen," Jessica said, and they all turned their eyes to her again. Creepy, like I'm really a grown-up or something, she thought, uneasily. She took a deep breath. "I've dealt with things like this before." "Really?" Alana was suddenly skeptical. Ron watched her warily. Lisa opened one eye, then pressed her face back into Ron's shirt. "I'm not with them," Jessica said hurriedly. "I'm locked in here with you because I got caught trying to find out more about them." "Did you know about us?" Ron asked. "Not much, but I'm glad that I found you. Everybody's been looking for you. The people who took you, they're trying to hurt a friend of mine. They already have hurt her, and I came here to stop them, to save her from them. Now that I know you're here, I'm going to save you from them too." "You're locked in here just like us," Alana said, this time like she believed it. Jessica suppressed a smile, momentarily amused. "I have friends out there, and they're going to help. We're going to get you out of this. Alana still looked suspicious, but Lisa was peeking at her from behind her hair, loosening her grip on Ron's shirt for the first time. I promise you, everything is going to be all right, Jessica said with a surge of confidence. She looked at the children with calm determination, surprised to realize she had meant every word. John! Charlie! Carlton burst into John's apartment, the door hitting the wall as it swung open. Marla jumped, sitting up straight on the couch. Carlton, what's going on? He didn't respond. Scanning the room, Marla was alone. She had the TV on a low volume. The door to John's room was closed, and he went to it. No one's here, Marla said, with a hint of disapproval. But Carlton rushed to look inside anyway. John's not here, neither is Charlie, Marla called. Well, I ran into one of them. One of the Charlies, that is. The bad one. Where's John? Where's everyone? John and Charlie went somewhere. They seemed to be in a hurry, and they wouldn't say where they were going. Jessica? I haven't seen her. She's probably at home. I was just at her apartment. She's not there. Carlton stared at Marla, palpable dread rising between them. Charlie. The other Charlie. I didn't even hear her come in. She didn't knock or anything. It was like she knew Jessica wouldn't be there. Wait, shut up, Marla said suddenly, pointing to the TV. Marla, this is serious, Carlton said with an alarm. Look at this. They've been playing this commercial all day. Then the cartoonish face of a little girl, painted like a clown, filled the screen. Come dressed as a clown and eat for free, said a booming voice. Then the camera cut to the front of a restaurant. That's her! Carlton shouted. I mean, the sign! The girl on the sign! The clown girl thing! Marla leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Carlton stopped there for a moment. She was taller and a little attractive. It was really confusing. So many emotions. They've been playing these all day. New restaurant, animatronic characters. It's like the girl on the sign was all grown up and wanted to feed me pizza. Carlton! Marla yelled, snapping him back to the present. You know where it is? The new place? Yes, Marla announced. She flipped off the TV and stood. Let's go. Carlton looked her grimly up and down, then took the other earpiece out of his pocket. Put this in your ear, he said. It's all we have. Trust me. Okay. Marla snatched the earpiece out of his hand, on her way to the door. I guess you'll fill me in on the way. Carlton didn't answer, as he hurried after her, slamming the door behind them.